So now that we've seen a bit of what the Game SDK world can give us and what some of the basic tools are, let's actually start to build our Flappy game. The first thing I want to do is restore this terrain to a default. I could create an entirely new level, but it's a useful thing to know how to erase the height map. You'll find that in the terrain editor, under the edit menu, erase terrain. I think this is a bit misleading because you're not erasing the terrain, you're doing as this confirmation dialog says, you're erasing the height map. In other words, restoring everything to the default height of 32 meters. The next thing is I want to get rid of all of these entities. I can do this one of two ways. I can drag a box around them or click and shift click to try and select them all, but there's always a risk that I might miss some. So keep in mind that another way to access your entities is in the Level Explorer. Everything that I have in my level is contained here. It's also organized by layers. By default, we have the terrain, which is a special layer, and we have one normal layer called main. You'll notice right now that it's blue, which means that it's the active layer. If I were to go File, New Layer, and let's say I'm going to create one for my pipe obstacles later, I could right-click on that and make that the active layer, and it will become blue. But for now, I'm going to work on my main layer right here. And my point is that if I want to be sure that I'm selecting all of my entities, I can see them listed here in the Level Explorer, and I can click on them and delete them or do whatever I want to do. If I make my window wider here, you'll see there's some additional information, including which layer an entity is on and the type of entity that it is. And you can sort by any of these things just by clicking on the column name. So go ahead and delete all of the stuff that you added because we're neither going to use terrain nor trees nor rocks nor any of that thing. Our game is pretty simple in terms of the entities. So the first thing I want to do is actually create our player. And I want to point out that we're going to be working with legacy entities. These were created in the time that the Game SDK was created, and they're all controllable through FlowGraph. So if you click on the Create Object tool, Legacy Entities, now we want to go down to the Physics group and create something called a RigidBodyEx. And EX in this case stands for extended. And if you look at the properties of this thing, you'll see there are a lot of them, given that this is just a simple sort of primitive object. And that comes from this Game SDK first-person shooter sort of world. There are a lot more properties and controls than we really need for our Flappy game, but that's okay. So the first thing we notice is it snaps to the terrain, of course. And what we need to do is make this object physical. We need to make it respond to gravity and respond to other physics forces that we apply. So if you scroll down in your properties here to the Lua properties, Lua is a plain text scripting language. What we're interested in are the physics properties right here. You'll notice that the density and the mass are by default -1. -1 simply means switch them off. Neither of these things are in effect. Let's change that and give this thing a mass of 10 kilograms. We want to keep Physicalize on so it responds to forces. And we don't want it to be resting. We want it to be moved by anything that pushes against it, whether it's wind, the player, a bullet, whatever it is. So we're going to turn off this resting thing. And if you get yourself down to the terrain so you don't fall and die, and go into game mode, you'll see now that I can actually push this thing. If I go into third-person view, I can use my body and it'll roll. It'll behave normally. If I shoot it, it's going to roll away. So I've successfully created a very simple entity, and for now that is going to be our player. Next thing I want to show you is, this is obviously very simple right now. I have one entity on the level, but sometimes I can lose sight of something, lose track of where it is, or I get so far away from it that it doesn't render anymore. So if you quickly want to jump to something and you can't see it on the level, two things. First, find it in the Level Explorer, and then click on this gray bar, which is a sort of title of the perspective viewport, and press the G key. G is go to that object, and it simply means place the camera directly in front of it. So it's a quick way to traverse large distances in your level and find an object without having to search for it. So now that we have this thing here, let's do two things. First, we want to get in the habit of creating sensible names for all of our entities. A large game can have thousands of entities, and it's really crucial that we give them names that are super clear. I don't believe that we have to indicate the entity type in the name because that's always here in the Level Explorer. So I'm simply going to call this thing what it is, FlappyBoid. You'll notice that I'm not using spaces in my level names, my object names, or anything else that sort of becomes problematic. So I use underscores instead. You can also use initial caps like this, but keep in mind that in the Explorer outside of CryEngine, that capitalization isn't going to show up. So I'm pretty much in the habit of using underscores to separate words. Okay, next thing we want to do is let's assign a material to our Flappy that's a little more interesting than this default white. And that's in the general properties under material, not too surprisingly. If you happen to know the exact name and path of what you're looking for, you can click in this box and type it. But if you don't, you can use this browse button, this little folder button right here. Normally, our materials are going to be found in the materials folder, which is also where that pack file is going to show them being. If you design an object and a material that really is only specifically for that object, it's a good practice to keep it in the same folder as the object itself. Otherwise, if it's a more generic material, like a texture map of granite or wood that could be applied to many different kinds of objects, it's probably a good practice to keep it in the materials folder. So you can explore this. I'll give you a tip that the generic folder sounds unexciting, but it actually has most of the content of GameSDK materials. And you can pick anything you like here. I would just recommend that you don't pick glass or anything that's translucent, because it's going to create complexities with shaders that I'll explain later. I'm going to go for something wood. I can see that my thumbnails have not generated here. There's a trick to doing this. If I open my asset browser, let's say I want to see the thumbnails for this wood folder, I can right click on it and say generate thumbnails, and you'll see this dialog box as it quickly goes through the high resolution texture maps and generates these low resolution thumbnails. Okay, let's go back to assigning a material. Now when I browse my wood folder, I should be able to see something. All I really care about is that I can see when this thing is moving and spinning and that I don't lose track of it. So I'm going to maybe look for something that has a bright color like a red to it. This is even better. Wood beams red. Has a nice kind of texture to it, so I should be able to see it move, and I should see it clearly against the blue sky. Okay, so we have our object, we've given it a texture, we've given it a name. Let's put it into an exact position. I'm just going to center it more or less in my terrain, which is 1,024 meters in both directions, just to make all the math easy that we're going to have to do in terms of calculating relative positions. I'm going to put it at 500 and 500 on X and Y. So if I hit the G key, I can jump to it and see my camera is very close to that. That's just going to make it easy to do addition and subtraction later on. Now the next thing is we're not going to use the terrain at all. We're going to end up hiding it ultimately. So I want to get my Flappy up in the air so that the first thing that happens is gravity starts pushing him down, and I can add a jump mechanic to push him up. So I'm going to move him up to 100 meters. You could move him higher. And again, he's out of sight. I can see him up here against the sun. I'm just going to press the G key, and now my camera's up close to 100 meters as well. So now that we have our bird, let's do a quick little test. I'm going to come down to the ground so I don't fall and die. I'm going to go into full screen view. You'll see the shadow of our sphere directly underneath it because the sun is directly overhead. And I'm going to go into game mode and look up, and immediately you'll see that we have some kind of mechanics happening. We have a ball with mass, 10 kilograms, so gravity takes a hold of it, and within a couple seconds it's fallen to the ground. I also want to point out that something interesting has happened that you might not expect. The ball is still moving. It's rolling and rolling and rolling. And I'm just going to plant the question for you to consider right now. What could possibly be making that ball move when nothing seems to be touching it? It's going to become an important issue for the game later on. Now that we have our entity, I want to create our first game mechanic, which is I want to take the jump key, whatever that happens to be, on the Xbox, the PlayStation, or the PC. I'm not concerned about which physical key it is. I want this jump event to push my player straight up. So we're going to create our first script, and we're going to do that using FlowGraph. So if you don't already have FlowGraph open, go to the Tools menu and choose it here. I'm going to give it some space. And the next thing we have to consider is we have to store our FlowGraph script someplace. We can't attach it to nothing. We have to attach it to something. What I'm going to do is just use a very simple invisible entity called an AI tag point. AI, of course, refers to artificial intelligence, and a tag point's a very simple entity that's normally used for navigation. And by the way, you'll notice that I'm not seeing anything when this thing isn't selected. If I roll over it, I can see that there's a completely invisible entity there. And that's because I have something called the helpers switched off. And that's this top right H button on the perspective viewport. This is a super important button. Normally, you're going to want to leave this on. It's only when you get hundreds or thousands of entities that your level can start to look kind of cluttered, and you may occasionally want to turn this off. But since it makes a lot of things completely invisible and hard to select, most of the time you're going to want to keep your helpers on. So this little purple glowing thing is trying to indicate that this is an entity that the player is not going to see in the game, but it's a useful generic sort of entity where we can house our script. Again, I'm going to follow custom and give it a name. It's an AI tag point, but what it's really going to be used for is flow graph. So I'm going to call it FG, and this is going to house all of my main game mechanics. So I'm going to call it FG_main. You can really name it anything you like, but make sure it describes what its intended function is. So to create our first flow graph script, we right click on the entity, either here or here, and say create flow graph. And it's going to ask us to create a group name, which is like a folder in flow graph. For lack of a better idea, I'm going to call it main. So now I'm going to make my flow graph tool bigger. And what should happen is this entity should show up under entities in this main folder, but we see nothing. And that's because there's a little quirk to the flow graph tool. If it's already open, when you add a new flow graph, it doesn't refresh this tree automatically. So the trick is right click anywhere in here and say reload the graph list. And lo and behold, there's our main group. And there's our first script, FGMain. And now we're actually ready to create some game mechanics. So the classic way to begin here is to control what happens when the game starts, when this particular level loads. And that is literally called a game start node. All of the nodes are broken into folders or groups, and you'll see this in the nodes pane here. If any of these are missing, you'll see them all in the view menu. So if we come down to the game folder, you'll see a node called start. And to get it into the graph, I literally just drag it, and there's my first node. To zoom in on the graph, just use the scroll wheel to zoom in and zoom out. To pan, to move around the graph, drag the right mouse button. So let's look at the characteristics of a flow graph node. It has inputs on the left, and it has outputs on the right. So our logic for our game is going to flow much as an English-style language reads, left to right. The title of the node, of course, is up here. When it's selected, it has this blue border, and it has sort of a dark gray border when it's not selected. To move it, just click it and drag it, and it sort of snaps to this grid. And by the way, this grid is infinite. You can go on and on and on with it. Because game start is such a common thing, it's pretty tough to build a game without a game start node. There's a little shortcut that I'm going to show you because we're going to do this a lot. I'm going to click on this and press the delete key. And I'm going to right click on my flow graph anywhere in this blank space, and you'll see a shortcut that says add start node. And that's exactly the same thing as dragging this node onto the graph. The next thing we need to talk about is there's something called the player, and that's the idea of who is it that's playing the game, or who is the entity that represents the person playing the game. And in GameSDK, that is this guy whose hands I'm seeing or whose entire body I'm seeing here. This is going to become a really important concept when you're using GameSDK as your sort of template. The engine thinks of this guy as the player with a capital P. So all of the input from the keyboard and the mouse, for example, are being routed through him. So we have to capture that, all that input from the local player, and route it to our player, which is just this little sphere. So we need to find something called local player. This isn't necessarily an intuitive thing that you would know. This is something you just have to learn or be taught. So if we look under the actor group, we'll see something called local player, the thing that's been defined as the player. And I'm going to put that right here. And you'll notice there's something called entity ID. This is a key concept. Every single entity that I add to a level automatically gets a sequentially generated integer assigned to it, and that's the entity ID. You can't see them, you don't have to worry about them, and you don't really care about them, except the engine code does care because that's how it identifies them. There's nothing to stop you from having two entities with the same name, but there's no way that you can have two entities with the same ID number because they're automatically assigned. So what we want to do is listen for this jump key, and then we want to get that to trigger a physics impulse that pushes up. So we know we need to listen, and that's about as much as we know. We're not familiar with these nodes or their groups. Let's just start to type a word in the search box here. And you can see, well, there's still quite a few that have to do with it, but there's something here called input, and that kind of zeroes in on what we're looking for. In that is something called action maps, and this happens to be the node we're looking for, action listener. Again, I know this is not a particularly intuitive start to searching for flow graphs, but I'm going to emphasize the point over and over again that if you kind of know what you're trying to do here, you can just try typing a simple English word, and oftentimes that will save you a lot of searching through these node groups. You'll notice here that there's a big red stripe. It's trying to get your attention, and that's saying you got to tell me which entity to listen to, and that's where I need an entity ID. Specifically, I need to tell it, you listen to the player, that guy that's been defined as the player that walks around with the guns. So I'm going to make my first connection simply by dragging from this output port to this input port. The next thing is I need to start this listening when the game starts. I need to enable this node, and that's going to happen on game start. So I'm going to drag the output of my game start to the enable input of my action listener. The next thing I need to do is tell it what to listen for, which particular action, and I'm just kind of working my way down the list. And I'm going to get that here. There's two ways to edit the values of a port. You can edit them over here in the properties window right here. So I can click in here. Or there's a shortcut, which is to just double click directly on something. It does exactly the same thing. This is a little bigger since I have zoom control over it. So I kind of like that. It's a bit faster as well. So I'm going to double click here, and you'll notice I could type the name of the action if I already know it, but I don't. So I'm going to use this browse button right here. And we have a long list of actions that pops up. We can expand this. What I'm interested in is input that gets routed through the player. There's also a lot of other entities in GameSDK, believe it or not, including vehicles, helicopters, boats, all sorts of fun stuff. But I'm interested in what happens to the player when he's just walking around. And the action I'm interested in this case is just going to be jump. I'm just picking this because it's a very easy key to reach for on any of the platforms. On the PC especially, it's a spacebar key. So I'm listening for the jump as heard by the player. Now, what do I want to do about it? Well, when that key is pressed, I want to apply a physics impulse to that bird. So I could do this when the key is held down or when the key is released, but it makes more sense to just do it when it's tapped. The question is, how do I affect the physics? How do I counteract gravity? Well, let's look around here, and it turns out that there is a group called physics. And the first node that we're going to see here is called action impulse, and that turns out to be exactly what we need. We need to apply an impulse along the z-axis. So when the key is pressed, we want to activate this impulse. So that's what we're trying to do. We have to tell it who are we trying to affect, and that's our FlappyBoid. So now comes one of the most important things that you'll ever do in FlowGraph, and you'll do it over and over again, and that's to assign an entity from the level. So I can select it through the Level Explorer, or I can hit the G key and select the bird visually here. It's way up in the air. It doesn't matter. They do the same thing. If I select it here, it also highlights it in the Level Explorer. Now that I have it selected, I can right-click on this red stripe where it says Choose Entity and assign the selected entity ID to this particular node input. The nice thing is, while FlowGraph works in terms of entity IDs, what it shows you is the name. So you don't have to deal with these random integers. You can see nice normal names that you gave them. I want to point out another thing that's helpful for thinking your way through building a FlowGraph script. If you think in terms of the English W questions, what are we trying to do? Who are we trying to do it to? When do we want it to happen? Where do we want it to happen? So what we're affecting is FlappyBoid. When we want it to happen is when the jump key is pressed. And what do we want to happen? Well, we want to apply an impulse along the z-axis. So I'm going to double click here. There's 3 numbers, and I know I want to push up. I have no idea how big this push will be, so I just have to test. I'm going to try a number randomly, 200. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and we've created our first game mechanic. Let's test it. Save, F11 for full screen. I'm going to move down to the terrain so I don't fall and die because I know I'm going to spawn on the terrain. Move, move, move. Here I am. And Control G to start the game. And here comes the bird falling, falling, falling. I'm going to let him fall all the way down to the train and walk forward a bit. Now, when I press the jump key, which is the space bar, the bird should jump. And indeed it does. So our mechanic is successful. You'll also notice that, of course, I'm jumping as well, because I haven't stopped the player from also hearing the jump key and saying, oh, you want me to jump in the air? That's fine, I'll do that. So that's one of the many things that I need to disable about the player. I don't want him shooting weapons, I don't want him jumping, and I don't want him walking around.